Good evening. I hope everybody's having a great day. I'm Clint Carter, the senior pastor at Cedarwood Community Church. Thank you for joining us for our Wednesday night Bible study. And as we go through this whole episode with the coronavirus, we're just trying to figure out other ways that we can continue to have church and in some creative ways. So thanks for joining us. We'll be doing this every Wednesday at 6:30, and we're going to start our Bible study. We're going to go through the book of First Samuel. So I want to start out by asking you a question. Have you ever wanted something really bad? Or have you ever had someone continuously taunt you or make fun of you? If you answered yes to either one of those questions, then you can relate to Hannah. And we're introduced to Hannah in First Samuel chapter 1. And Hannah was a woman that was loved by her husband, but she also wanted a child very badly. And all the people around her seem to be having children, and she's just wondering, when am I going to have a child? You know, all of us at times have longings for something. Maybe it's a longing for a better job. Maybe it's a longing for a happier marriage. Maybe it's a longing for a second chance in life. So, what do you do? What should you do when you have longings that go unmet? I think we're going to answer that question in our study tonight. In chapter 1, verse 1, we're introduced to a man named Elkanah. Now, he had two wives, and it says one was named Hannah and the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. And so we're immediately introduced to a problem. This man has two wives. One has children, one does not have children. And in the Old Testament, this was a problem, because someone that did not have children, not only did they have an emotional turmoil going on in their life, there was also social and economic and religious stigmatisms that went with that. In a social setting, motherhood was the most important role for a woman. Also, they were considered to be very unproductive if they did not have children. From a social economic standpoint, children represented security, a family's inheritance passed on from the father to the son. And if you had no children, that means that you could lose the land that had been in your family for generations. It would pass on to another male in the family, and that land would be given away. See, a widow could not inherit her husband's property. And because of that, when a husband died and they had no children, the woman that was barren would become destitute. And her only options was to depend upon the people around her to provide for her, or she might have to sell herself into prostitution or even into slavery. Also, from an economic standpoint, because this was an agriculture society, children were a labor force. And if you didn't have, the more children you had, the more laborers you had. And if you didn't have children, that forced you to have to hire workers, you had to have slaves, but it puts you at an economic disadvantage, or you might even have to sell some of your land because you couldn't work it. From a religious standpoint, God had commanded that we go out and multiply. That's told to us in Genesis 1:28. Children were considered a blessing by God, and when somebody couldn't have children, society saw them as being unfavored by God, and so this added a stigmatism to that particular person. And so there was just a tremendous amount of pressure in that society to have a child. It also caused, like in the case of Sarah and Adam, that Sarah had Abraham sleep with her maidservant in order to have an heir. Some would take sacrificial vows. We'll see Hannah does that. Some resorted to worshiping other gods, fertility gods and goddesses, so they would have a child. Infertility was considered a woman's problem. Nowhere in the Old Testament do we see them ever blame the man. In verse 3, it says, year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year, and whenever Hannah went up in the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and could not eat. Her husband, Elkanah, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more than 10 sons? Elkanah's home was a devoted home, but it was also a divided home. Strife was strangling this home, and it was coming from Peninnah. Why? Because she was the first to have children, but Hannah was the one that was most loved by her husband. And Peninnah, she was tired of playing second fiddle. And so she became Hannah's adversary, and her bitterness was destroying this home. So here's Hannah, and she wants a child so badly, and what does Peninnah do? Taunts her and ridicules her and makes fun of her year after year after year, and it would make Hannah cry, and then she wouldn't eat. You ever been in a situation for a long period of time and you're wondering where you're going to get through the pain, wondering if it will ever end? In verse 9 it says, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Hannah is broken. She's bitter. She's discouraged. She's depressed. She's hurt. And she's probably hungry. She's been tormented. She's been mocked. All by her rival, who's been acting like a toothache that just won't go away. How did Hannah respond to her situation? She maintained her faith in God. She prayed. She cried out to God. You know what? In difficult situations, we either get closer to God or we get farther away from God. And as we battle this coronavirus and all the things that are going with that, it's either a time for us to grow closer to God or for us to go farther away from God. In verse 12 it says, as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of great anguish and grief. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. And she said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Here is this poor woman. She's broken. Her reputation has taken a beating because she didn't have a child. She's been taunted by years by Peninnah, and her own husband doesn't understand her. Now the priest thinks she's drunk. I just want you to remember this. God is in the business of using broken things. And here's our problem. One is longings are universal. Every one of us has some kind of longing, something that we're longing for. And often God plants those in our hearts. He gives us those desires, like he gave Hannah the desire to be a mother. But sometimes we have to realize that only God can fulfill the desires of our heart. The second thing is we all have desires and we all want them fulfilled, but we want them fulfilled on our timetable. When I was a kid, one of my favorite movies was Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, I remember one scene where there was a rich girl. Her name was Veruca Salt. And in there she saw an Oompa Loompa for the first time, and I'll never forget what she said to her dad. This spoiled little brat. I want an Oompa Loompa, and I want an Oompa Loompa now. And isn't that like us sometimes? We want what we want, and we want it now. And when we don't get it immediately, what are our reactions? We're frustrated, we're confused, we're angry, we're sad, we're disappointed, we feel like we've been ignored. And that's exactly how Hannah felt. Even her husband didn't fully understand what she was going through. He loved her, but that wasn't enough. And then to make matters worse, sometimes people don't understand what our hopes and what our dreams are. And they see you weeping or they see you crying, and they see that as a weakness, and they use it against us. It says in 1 Samuel 6, verses 6 and 7, it says, her rival, because of the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year, and whenever Hannah went up from the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and could not eat. Talk about rubbing salt into the wound. Can you imagine what it must have been like to be Hannah? So what should we do when our longings go unmet? We should do what Hannah did. And the first thing that she did is you let your emotions out. She went and she talked to her husband. She told their husband what she was feeling. And he said that he loved her. Have you ever noticed that crying and talking something out always seems to ease the pain? She prayed. In Philippians 4:6, it tells us, in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. The little nugget that you might want to write down is, prayer doesn't always bring immediate resolution, but it always brings immediate relief. And don't you find that to be true? Maybe when you pray, all of a sudden the answer doesn't immediately come, but don't you feel better after you prayed? And Hannah prayed. She wept and she poured her heart out to God. And here's the thing, she was honest, she was emotional, and she was very specific in what she was asking for. Did her situation change? No, not yet. Now those that know the rest of the story knows that it does, but not yet. But her heart changed. She now had hope for the first time in a long time because she had put her hope in God. The third thing is turn your situation over to God. Turn your fears and your troubles and your longings to God. Just turn them over to Him. And then the third thing is don't give up. Hannah never gave up. There was a man in the turn of the century, of the 18th, 19th century, and his name was William Wilberforce. And he was a very wealthy man that really didn't care much about what was going on in society. He just wanted to live his life to the fullest, gamble and chase women and drink and all of those things. Very highly educated at Cambridge, came from a very good family, decided that he was going to run for Parliament, easily won. But then all of a sudden things changed. He was always went to church, but he never really was a believer. And one day in church, the preacher was up preaching and said that you need a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And he gave his life to Jesus Christ, and his life soon changed. He even wrote a book about it and talked about all of his old friends, about the need for them to come to know who Jesus Christ is. He had a good friend named John Newton who told him about the horrors of the slave trade. And so William Wilberforce ended up going out in Parliament and trying to get the slave trade stopped. And for 20 years, that was his life goal, is to make that happen, to get a law passed ending the slave trade. And several times there were bills that were about to pass. Matter of fact, in one particular case in 1796, he had the votes. He had public sentiment on his side. And he lost by one vote because 12 people didn't show up to vote. And here was this man, life ambition. But here's the thing. When he first was elected to Parliament, there was only 2 Christians in all of Parliament. When he left Parliament, there was 100 in both houses. Just a few days before he passed away, Parliament voted to end the slave trade. See, many Christians have a difficult time with patience. You know why? Because we live in a society where we want everything now. We have fast food restaurants. We microwave our food. We shop at convenience stores. Why do you think that Hannah was able to show such great patience and perseverance? Because she knew that as she walked through the desert of childlessness, that God was there in the desert with her. Folks, no matter what you're going through, God is in the desert with you. So what are you longing for? Have you given up? Have you made it known to God? Have you turned your longing over to Him? And finally, how did God speak to you through this message? What did you get out of it? And how can you apply it to your life? May God bless you. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Until we meet again.